I've given a lot of interviews in my time, sat across from hosts who were thoughtful, hosts who were genuinely curious, and yes, hosts who thought they were a whole lot smarter than they actually were. Most of the time, I just roll with it. I've learned that in this ministry, you take the good with the bad, and you don't let much get under your skin. But there was this one time, must have been about 15 years ago now, when I walked into a studio for what I thought would be a standard promotional interview, and I encountered something different, something that still sticks with me today. Not because it bothered me, but because it taught me something about human nature and about the games people play when they think they've got you cornered. The setup was simple enough. A new book was coming out, the promotional tour was in full swing, and my publicist had scheduled me for this talk show that was gaining popularity at the time. The host had a reputation for being provocative, which didn't concern me much. I've never been afraid of tough questions. In fact, I prefer them to the softball nonsense that wastes everyone's time. But there's a difference between being provocative and being disrespectful, between challenging someone's ideas and trying to humiliate them for sport. I walked onto that set the same way I've walked onto every platform for the past several decades. Prepared, professional, and ready to share a message of hope. The lights were bright, the audience was warm, and the host greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You develop an instinct for these things after a while. You can tell when someone's genuinely interested in conversation versus when they're loading a weapon. But I've never been one to back down from a challenge. So I sat down, smiled back, and waited to see what he had in mind. The first 10 minutes went fine. We talked about the book, about the power of positive confession, about some of the testimonies we'd received from people whose lives had been changed. Standard stuff. He was charming enough, made the audience laugh a few times, and I started to think, maybe I'd read him wrong. Maybe he was just nervous, and that's what I'd picked up on. But then, right when we were settling into a comfortable rhythm, he shifted. The smile changed, the tone changed, and I knew we were about to go somewhere else entirely. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his legs, and said something like, Pastor Osteen, your ministry, your books, your television broadcasts, they're all incredibly successful and frankly very profitable. As a businessman, you've built an empire on a message of living your best life now, of abundance and blessings. You're a television preacher who lives a very comfortable life. He paused for effect, letting that hang in the air. The audience was quiet now, sensing the shift. I'm curious, he continued, how that squares with the teachings of Jesus. Because you've talked about your faith before, haven't you? And I'm just wondering, how does someone who believes in Jesus reconcile that with the many scriptures about the poor, about giving up earthly possessions, and about how it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God? Now, let me be clear about something. I don't mind questions about faith, about prosperity, or about the practical application of scripture. I've thought about these things my whole life. I was raised in the church and my ministry is founded on God's word. I've never pretended to have all the answers. Faith is personal, it's complicated, and it's not something I wear on my sleeve for public consumption only to impress. But I am not ashamed of it either, and I'm certainly not afraid to discuss it with someone who's genuinely curious. But this wasn't genuine curiosity. This was a trap. The way he phrased it, the timing of it, the tone in his voice, it was all designed to put me in a box. Either I had to denounce the very nature of my ministry and the success God has given it, admitting that I'd spent my career promoting something contrary to my beliefs, or I had to denounce a significant portion of biblical teaching, admitting I was a hypocrite who didn't really believe what I claimed to believe. It was a false choice designed to make me look foolish no matter which way I turned. And the worst part was, he thought he was being clever. He thought he'd found the perfect gotcha question, the kind of moment that would go viral and make him look like some kind of intellectual heavyweight who'd put the famous television preacher in his place. I looked at him for a moment, let the silence stretch out just long enough to make him uncomfortable. The audience was dead quiet. You could have heard a pin drop in that studio. And then I said something along these lines. That's an interesting question. Mind if I ask you one first? He looked a little surprised, but he recovered quickly, spreading his hands in a gesture of openness. Of course, he said, fire away. Do you believe God wants his children to live a life of peace, joy, and purpose? I asked him. He blinked. Whatever he'd expected, that wasn't it. Well, he said, I think those are complicated concepts. I think most situations exist in shades of gray, And I think reducing complex spiritual questions to simple binaries is usually a mistake. That's a long way of not answering the question, I said. But let me try this differently. Do you believe there are people in the world who are struggling, who are hurting, who feel lost and without hope? Of course, he said, obviously, there are people like that. And do you believe those people should be helped? Should they be lifted up, encouraged, and shown a path to a better life? Yes, but hold on, I interrupted, raising a hand. I'm not done. Should those people be helped? Even if helping them requires resources, even if it requires building platforms to reach them, even if it requires a large organization to spread that message of hope, because you can't always reach millions of people on a shoestring budget. You can't always share a message of encouragement and healing if you don't have the means to publish books, produce broadcasts, and host events. Do you agree with that? He was starting to look uncomfortable now, realizing he'd lost control of the conversation. I suppose in extreme situations, yes, there may be a need for significant resources. Okay, I said. So we've established that there are times when resources are not only acceptable, but necessary when it's the moral thing to do to facilitate widespread impact. Now let's talk about Jesus, since you brought him up. You're right that Jesus talked about giving up earthly possessions and serving the poor. That's in the Gospels. But you know what else Jesus did? He fed 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fish. He turned water into wine at a wedding when the celebration ran out. He didn't just meet people's spiritual needs, he met their practical needs. He demonstrated abundance. The host tried to interject, but I kept going. Now you might say, well, that was different. That was Jesus. And he was making a point about God's miraculous provision. Fair enough, but the Bible is full of examples of righteous prosperity, of people God blessed abundantly. Abraham, Solomon, Job, they weren't poor. God blessed them so they could be a blessing to others. This idea that Christianity is purely about poverty, that it condemns all material blessing under all circumstances, that's simply not supported by the text. I could see him trying to formulate a response, so I leaned forward a bit, keeping my voice calm and steady. But let me get to the heart of what I think you are really asking. You want to know if I think a pastor can be blessed by God financially and still be faithful to the teachings of Jesus? And the answer is absolutely. My message isn't about glorifying wealth for its own sake. It's about understanding that God is a God of abundance, not scarcity. He wants us to live full, rich lives, spiritually, emotionally, relationally, and yes, even materially. Not so we can hoard it, but so we can be a conduit of his blessings to a hurting world. Here's the thing, I continued. Jesus didn't just come to save perfect people. He came to save broken people. He spent his time with tax collectors, prostitutes, sinners of all kinds. The entire point of Christianity, as I understand it, is that we're all fallen, we're all flawed, and we all need grace. So when you ask me how I reconcile the blessings God has given in my ministry with believing in Jesus, my answer is simple. These blessings are exactly the kind of resources Jesus can use to reach more people. They're what enable us to share his message of hope, to help those struggling with right and wrong in a world that doesn't offer easy answers. The audience was completely silent now, and I could see I had everyone's attention, including the host's, though he didn't look particularly happy about it. Let me tell you about what we do at Lakewood. We preach a message of hope, of possibility, of God's unfailing love. We tell people that no matter what they've done, no matter what they're facing, God has a plan to prosper them and give them a future. That's not just financial, it's emotional, spiritual, relational. We equip people to navigate life's challenges with faith. We encourage them to speak victory over their circumstances, to believe for a better tomorrow. That's not celebrating greed, that's exploring the human condition. That's asking difficult questions about despair, about brokenness, about how to find strength in tough times. It's about helping people connect with their divine purpose and potential. I paused, making sure he was following. Now, is that a traditional Christian message? I don't know. But it's a message that wrestles with human struggles in a serious way. It doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't tell you that life will always be perfect or without challenge. It shows you the power of faith and lets you think about it. And I believe that kind of honest exploration of difficult topics is more valuable than simplistic moralizing that pretends the world is simpler than it actually is. The host finally found his voice. But surely, he said, you can see how some people might be troubled by the idea of a person of faith, a pastor and television preacher, having such a visible level of wealth and success. Some people are troubled by everything, I said with a slight smile. Some people think dancing is sinful. Some people think playing cards is sinful. Some people think reading certain books is sinful. But here's what I've learned over the years. Faith isn't about hiding from difficult realities. It's not about pretending evil doesn't exist or that dealing with evil is always simple and straightforward. Faith is about having a moral compass that guides you through difficult realities. And part of that compass, for me, is believing that God desires for us to live in abundance so that we can be a blessing to others and effectively spread His message. I settled back in my chair, getting more comfortable as I warmed to the subject. You know, I've written a lot of books and preached countless sermons over the years, and I've tried to share messages that matter. Messages about real people facing real challenges. Sometimes those challenges involve poverty, illness, or heartbreak. And whether we like it or not, lack is part of the human experience. It's part of history. It's part of current events. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. But I've always tried to portray God's ability to bring us through it honestly, not glamorously. When someone is facing a hardship, I don't just tell them to endure it stoically. I tell them to stand on God's promises, to speak faith, to believe for a breakthrough. There are consequences to their actions, yes, but also consequences to their words and their beliefs. That's what I think is missing from your question. I continued, you're acting like I make my ministry about celebrating money, that I tell people it's great to go out and get rich for selfish gain. That's not what I do. I share a message that acknowledges life's struggles exist and that sometimes good people need to confront them with spiritual strength and resilience. That's reality. And helping people think about how to navigate that reality, how to maintain their humanity and their moral center even in difficult circumstances by tapping into God's abundant grace and favor. That's not contrary to faith. That's essential to faith. The host was clearly struggling now, trying to regain control of the interview. But what about the specific teaching of Jesus to give up everything and follow Him? He pressed. How do you reconcile that with a businessman who preaches about blessings and prosperity? I nodded, acknowledging the question. That's a fair point, and it's worth discussing. The give up everything teaching is found in various places in the gospel, often in the context of discipleship, where Jesus was calling specific individuals to leave their nets and follow Him into itinerant ministry. The context there is about placing God first, about not letting anything, even good things, become an idol that keeps us from His call. It's a teaching about priorities and submission to God's will. But that same Jesus, I went on, also told parables like the parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25, where the master praised the servants who invested their resources and multiplied them, rebuking the one who buried his. Now, why would Jesus commend those who multiplied their talents if He was teaching absolute renunciation of all worldly goods? The answer is that He wasn't teaching absolute poverty. He was teaching wisdom, discernment, and the proper stewardship of resources. There's a difference between greed driven by selfish ambition and prosperity pursued to honor God and make a greater impact. I could see the audience was really engaged now, leaning forward, thinking about what I was saying. Let me give you a modern example, I said. If someone is consumed by the pursuit of money at the expense of their family, their health, their spiritual life, then yes, that's problematic. Jesus would call them to repentance and to reorder their priorities. But if I, as a television preacher and pastor, am blessed with the resources to build a larger platform, to publish more books, to reach millions with a message of hope and encouragement, and to support countless charitable initiatives, is that not using my talents for God's glory? Is that not fulfilling the Great Commission more effectively? The host tried one more time. But isn't that just justifying what you want to do anyway? Isn't that picking and choosing which parts of Jesus' teaching to follow? I smiled at that. No, I said, that's called reading in context and trying to understand the full scope of moral and spiritual teaching. Every belief system requires interpretation. Every faith tradition requires wisdom and application. If you take sell all you have and give to the poor as an absolute command that applies to every single Christian in every situation without exception, then you end up with absurd conclusions. You'd have to condemn every Christian who owns a home or a car or has a savings account. You'd have to condemn every pastor whose church has a building or a budget to operate. You'd have to condemn every Christian businessman who uses their company to create jobs and support their community. Does that sound like wisdom to you? He didn't have a good answer for that, so I continued. The question isn't whether God wants us to have resources. History and common sense tell us resources are necessary to accomplish great things, even for God. The question is, how do we acquire them and how do we use them? Those are the questions my ministry explores. Not should we seek blessings, but how do we seek blessings without becoming prideful or selfish? Not should we pursue success, but how do we pursue success without losing our humanity? Those are the hard questions, the ones worth asking. I paused, letting that sink in. And here's something else worth considering. Jesus didn't just teach with words. He taught with stories, parables. He used fiction to illustrate truth. He talked about shepherds leaving their flocks to find lost sheep, about fathers welcoming home prodigal sons, about workers in vineyards and seeds falling on different kinds of soil. None of those things literally happened. They were stories designed to make people think, to illustrate deeper truths about human nature and God's character. So when I write a book or preach a sermon that tells a story about a flawed person struggling with difficult moral choices and how God's grace and promises can lift them up, I'm doing something similar. I'm using storytelling to explore truth and inspire faith. The audience was completely with me now, and I could see the host knew he'd lost this round. But I wasn't done yet. You know what I think the real problem is? I said, I think we've gotten so comfortable in our modern, relatively affluent society that we've forgotten how challenging life can be. We've forgotten that for most of human history, and still in many parts of the world today, people face genuine hardship on a regular basis. They face poverty that cripples, illness that devastates, despair that consumes. And in those circumstances, the moral question isn't whether it's okay to have hope and believe for abundance. The moral question is whether it's okay not to offer hope, not to believe for a better future, when that message is the only thing standing between innocent people and utter defeat. I grew up during my father's ministry, I continued. I saw hardship. I saw what people are capable of when they're desperate. I've traveled the world. I've seen poverty, sickness, and despair up close. And I've met people who were willing to stand up against those things, sometimes at great personal cost, by simply holding on to faith. Some of those people were saints. Many of them weren't. They were just ordinary people trying to do the right thing in difficult circumstances, drawing on God's promises for strength. Those are the people I like to preach to write for. Not because they're perfect, but because they were real. I leaned forward again, my voice becoming more intense. And I'll tell you something, Yishlaim. Some of the most Christian people I've ever met have been those who refuse to give up hope in the face of impossible odds. I've known cancer patients who prayed for healing, who spoke life over their bodies, who carried the burden of illness, but refused to let it define them because they believed in God's restorative power. Were they perfect Christians? No. Are any of us? But they were trying to live out their faith in the real world, not in some theoretical paradise where hard choices don't exist. Jesus said, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Well, that's what I preach. That's what I write about. That's what my ministry is all about, helping people experience that abundant life. The host was clearly ready to move on to another topic, but I had one more point to make. You asked me how I reconcile being a businessman and television preacher with believing in Jesus, but I think you're making the mistake in how you understand both success and faith. Being successful doesn't mean being cruel or heartless. It means being effective enough to do what's necessary, even when it's difficult. It means having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you something, like public criticism. And faith isn't about being weak or passive. It's about having the moral strength to do the right thing, to believe for breakthrough, even when the right thing is hard. The Jesus I read about in the Bible, I said, wasn't a weak man. He stood up to corrupt religious leaders. He challenged unjust systems. He defended the marginalized and the powerless. He lived a life of purpose and power, demonstrating God's goodness and abundance everywhere he went. That took incredible strength. That took a toughness of spirit most of us will never comprehend. So this idea that Christianity is incompatible with strength, with effectiveness, with living an abundant life, that's just wrong. It's a misunderstanding of what Jesus actually taught and how he actually lived. I sat back, crossed my arms, and looked at the host. So to answer your original question, no, I don't see any contradiction between the ministry God has given me and my faith. My work is about imperfect humans struggling with difficult circumstances, just like we all are, and how God's grace and power can lift them up. Faith doesn't mean pretending those circumstances don't exist. It means having a moral foundation and a spiritual power that guides you through them. And if my broadcasts and books help people think about those issues, if they help people grapple with questions of hope and healing and the proper stewardship of God's blessings, then I think I'm doing something worthwhile. The studio was absolutely silent for a moment, and then the audience burst into applause. Not the polite applause you get when someone says something nice, but real, sustained applause from people who felt like they'd heard something meaningful. The host looked like he'd been hit with a 2x4. He stammered out something about going to commercial, and during the break, he barely looked at me. When we came back from commercial, his whole demeanor had changed. The smugness was gone. The gotcha attitude had evaporated. We finished the interview talking about the book, and he was perfectly professional, but the dynamic had shifted. He'd come in thinking he could trap me, make me look foolish, score some cheap points, and instead he'd gotten a lesson in theology, philosophy, and the real complexity of spiritual application. After the interview, as I was leaving the studio, a few crew members came up to me and shook my hand. One guy, a sound engineer in his 40s, had tears in his eyes. He told me his wife had lost her job, that he was struggling with providing for his family, and that he was going to listen to a recording of this interview. He thought it might help him understand that faith and financial struggle weren't incompatible, that you could be a person of faith and still believe for God's provision, that you could maintain hope even when things seem bleak. That moment meant more to me than anything that happened during the actual interview, because that's what it's really about, isn't it? It's not about winning arguments or looking smart on television. It's about helping people navigate real life, real struggles, real moral complexity. It's about offering something useful to people who are trying to figure out how to live with integrity in a messy world. Now, I'm not claiming to have all the answers. I don't. I'm still figuring things out myself, still wrestling with questions, still learning. But I've learned a few things over the years. And you know, one of them is this: faith isn't about having simple answers to complex questions. It's about having a foundation that helps you navigate complexity with integrity. It's about trying to do the right thing even when the right thing isn't obvious. And it's about extending grace to others and to yourself when you fall short. The people my messages reach over the years, they're all trying to do that in their own way. They're flawed, broken, sometimes confused, but they're trying. They're struggling with right and wrong. They're attempting to find meaning and purpose in difficult circumstances. And I think that's profoundly human and profoundly spiritual, even when they don't use religious language to describe what they're going through. I've built a ministry around addressing challenges like despair, poverty, and hopelessness. But I've also tried to share messages about redemption, about overcoming, about the possibility of change. I've tried to show that even the worst among us might have some good left, and even the best among us have darkness we struggle with. That's the human condition. That's what we're all living through. And exploring that through preaching and storytelling isn't contrary to faith. It's a way of processing faith, of working out what we believe about human nature and morality and the possibility of redemption. That host thought he was going to trap me with a simple question, but simple questions about faith and morality are usually traps of a different kind. They're traps that tempt us to give easy answers to hard questions, to pretend things are simpler than they are, to reduce complex moral reasoning to sound bites and slogans. Real faith, real morality requires more than that. It requires thought, wisdom, humility, and the willingness to grapple with difficulty. I don't preach to tell people what to think. I preach to show them life in all its complexity and God's power to lift them through it and let them figure out what they think. I present situations, principles, choices, consequences, and I trust the audience to engage with it thoughtfully. That's respecting people's intelligence and their own moral reasoning. And I think that's a more faithful approach than trying to spoon-feed simple messages to people as if they're children who can't handle nuance. The world is complicated. People are complicated. Morality is complicated. And any faith tradition worth following should be able to handle that complexity rather than running from it. Christianity has produced some of the greatest thinkers in history, people who wrestled with profound philosophical and moral questions. It's a rich, deep tradition with 2,000 years of people trying to figure out what it means to live faithfully in challenging circumstances. Reducing all of that to Christians must be poor and suffer is doing that tradition a great disservice. So when people ask me about faith and my work, I try to give them honest answers. I don't pretend to be a theologian or a saint. I'm a pastor, television preacher, and businessman who's trying to share messages that matter, messages that reflect the reality of human experience. Sometimes that involves addressing financial hardship. Sometimes that involves moral ambiguity. Sometimes that involves people making choices I wouldn't make or choices I wouldn't recommend. But it always involves honest exploration of what it means to be human, what it means to struggle with right and wrong, and what it means to try to do better even when you've failed before. That's what I told that host in so many words, and that's what I'd tell anyone else who thinks there's a simple contradiction between faith and the kind of messages I share. The contradiction only exists if you approach faith simplistically. If you think it's about following rules without understanding their purpose, or if you think being Christian means retreating from the difficult realities of life into some kind of sanitized fantasy world where challenges don't exist, and good people never have to make hard choices. But that's not the faith I know. The faith I know is about walking through darkness with a light to guide you. It's about making mistakes and finding forgiveness. It's about failing and getting back up. It's about recognizing your own brokenness and accepting grace. And it's about trying imperfectly to love others and do right by them, even when circumstances make that difficult. That's what the people in my messages are trying to do. They don't always succeed. They sometimes fail spectacularly, but they're trying. And that trying matters. That effort to do right, even when you're not sure what right is, even when you're haunted by past failures, even when the path forward isn't clear, that's what makes us human, and that's what makes for meaningful stories. I've been making broadcasts for a long time now, and I've been fortunate enough to share a lot of different messages. Some of them have been successful, some haven't. Some have resonated with audiences, some haven't. But the ones I'm most proud of are the ones that took risks, that didn't pander, that treated the audience as intelligent adults capable of handling complexity. Those are the messages that last, the ones that people come back to years later because they found something meaningful in them. And I think that's because those messages respect the audience's own moral and spiritual journey. They don't tell you what to think. They show you something true about human nature and God's power and let you wrestle with it. They trust that you're capable of engaging with difficult material and coming to your own conclusions. And in doing that, they honor the idea that every person is on their own journey, trying to figure out how to live with integrity and meaning. That host didn't understand that. He thought he could score cheap points by creating a false dichotomy, by making it seem like you had to choose between faith and honest engagement with life's realities. But that's not a real choice. Faith isn't about denying reality. It's about navigating reality with wisdom and grace. And sharing a message isn't about promoting greed. It's about exploring the human condition in all its complexity, including the difficult parts, and how God's goodness prevails. I left that studio that day knowing I'd said what I needed to say. I'd stood up for my work, for my faith, and for the idea that you don't have to check your brain at the door to be a person of faith. You can think deeply, question honestly, and explore difficult topics while still holding on to core values and beliefs. In fact, I'd argue that real faith requires that kind of honest engagement rather than running from it. The incident taught me something important, though. It taught me that a lot of people are looking for simple answers to complex questions, and they're disappointed or even hostile when you refuse to give them those answers. They want you to be easily categorized, to fit neatly into their understanding of how things should be. And when you don't, when you insist on complexity and nuance, some people see that as evasion or contradiction. But life is complex, faith is complex, morality is complex, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either naive or selling something. The real work of living faithfully isn't about memorizing rules and applying them mechanically. It's about developing wisdom, about learning to see clearly, about cultivating the judgment to know when different principles apply in different situations. That's hard work. It takes a lifetime, and it requires humility because you're going to get it wrong sometimes. That's what the people my messages reach are doing in their own way. They're trying to figure it out. They're making judgments in difficult circumstances with limited information. They're doing their best, and sometimes their best isn't good enough, and they have to live with that. But they keep trying. They don't give up. They don't surrender to nihilism or despair. They maintain their humanity even when it would be easier not to. Is that a Christian message? I think it is in its own way. It's a message about perseverance, about hope, about the possibility of redemption even for the worst among us. It's a message that says your past doesn't have to define your future, that change is possible, that grace is available. Those are Christian themes, even when they're not explicitly stated in Christian language. So, no, I don't feel any contradiction between my faith and my work. I feel like my work is in some ways an expression of my faith. Not in a preachy way, not in a way that beats people over the head with religious messaging, but in a way that takes seriously the moral and spiritual dimensions of human existence. In a way that acknowledges that life is hard, that people struggle, that we all need grace, and that redemption is always possible if we're willing to reach for it. That's what I wish I could tell every host, every interviewer, every person who thinks they found some clever contradiction in my life or work. There is no contradiction. There's only the complexity of real life and the attempt to navigate that complexity with integrity. That's all any of us can do. And if my ministry helps people think about how to do that, then I've accomplished something worthwhile. The truth is that host did me a favor. Even though that wasn't his intention, he gave me an opportunity to think through these issues more carefully, to articulate things I'd felt but maybe hadn't fully expressed before. And he gave me a chance to speak to people who might be wrestling with similar questions. People who wonder if you can be a person of faith and still engage honestly with the difficult, complicated parts of life. The answer is yes. Absolutely. Yes. In fact, I'd argue that's the only way to have real faith. Faith that matters. Faith that helps rather than hinders. Faith that retreats from difficulty isn't really faith at all. It's just fear dressed up in religious language. Real faith walks toward the hard questions, trusts that truth can withstand scrutiny, and believes that honest exploration will ultimately lead somewhere meaningful. That's the kind of faith I aspire to, imperfectly and inconsistently, but genuinely. And that's the kind of work I aspire to create. Messages that engage honestly with life's complexity rather than offering easy answers that don't actually help anyone. Whether I succeed or not, that's for others to judge. But I can tell you that the attempt is sincere, and that's all I know how to offer. So to that host, wherever he is now, I'd say thank you. Thank you for asking a question that seemed designed to embarrass me, but instead gave me a chance to think deeply and speak honestly about things that matter. Thank you for the opportunity to connect with people who needed to hear that faith and honest inquiry aren't enemies. And thank you for the reminder that the best response to a trap is not to avoid it, but to walk through it with clarity and conviction. That's what I've tried to do in my life and in my work. Walk through the hard stuff with clarity and conviction, without pretending it's easy or simple, but also without giving up or giving in. That's the example I saw in the people I admired growing up. That's the example I try to set in my ministry, and that's the example I hope to leave behind when I'm gone. We live in a time when people want simple answers, when they want to divide everyone into neat categories of good and bad, right and wrong, faithful and unfaithful. But life doesn't work that way. People are messy, situations are complicated, and the best we can do is try to act with integrity. Try to do more good than harm. Try to leave things a little better than we found them. That's not a very dramatic message, I know. It doesn't make for great television or viral moments, but it's true and it's worth saying. And if standing up for that truth means occasionally making a host look foolish when they try to trap you with false dichotomies, well, so be it. I've never been afraid of speaking my mind, and I'm not about to start now. The work continues, the questions continue, the struggle to do right continues, and that's okay. That's life, that's what it means to be human. And that's what I'll keep exploring in my messages for as long as I'm able to share them. Because I believe these questions matter, these struggles matter, and the attempt to live faithfully in a complex world matters. That's what I learned from that encounter with a rude host who thought he could trap me. He couldn't, not because I'm so smart or so quick, but because I've spent a lifetime thinking about these things, living with these questions, and trying to work out what I believe. And when you've done that work, when you've wrestled honestly with difficult questions, you're not easily shaken by someone else's clever gotcha moment. You stand firm, you speak truth, you refuse to accept false choices, and you trust that honest engagement with complexity will ultimately be more valuable than simple answers that don't actually address the real issues. That's my response. That's what I left that host speechless with. Not because I'm some great debater, but because I was willing to take his questions seriously, to engage with it honestly, and to offer something more than the canned response he was expecting. And in doing so, I hope I offered something useful not just to him, but to everyone who's ever wondered if you can be a person of faith and still engage honestly with the difficult, complicated parts of human existence. You can, you must. That's what real faith requires, and that's what I'll keep trying to do, one message at a time. That's how you handle the tough questions. Don't forget, faith isn't about avoiding complexity. It's about navigating it with grace. If this discussion challenged you to think deeper, hit the subscribe button and tell us in the comments, what's the hardest question you've ever wrestled with regarding faith and success?